Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event from the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. My name's Julian Huppert, and I have the great pleasure of being the director here at the Intellectual Forum, putting on these events. And it's great to welcome you, whether you are here in this wonderful Frankopan Hall in person, or you're watching us online, trying to reduce the pollution by travelling. Wherever in the world you are, it's great to have you with us. This is also going to be, as I'll explain later, a slightly unusual event because we are working with an organisation called QCast. So we've collected some questions and responses beforehand and we'll do some more afterwards. There'll be an opportunity for you to be part of that later as well. Now, I know some of you know Jesus College very well, and it's great to see the master here, who I'm not going to try to educate about the history of the college. For others of you, this may be your first time here, so I might just say a couple of words. There's an amazing history dating back to 1144, when a little plot of land was given by Nigel, Bishop of Ely, to a small group of itinerant nuns. That was then expanded when King Malcolm of Scotland gave some more land. You may realise this is not Scotland, slightly complex there. And for many hundreds of years, there was a very successful nunnery. The Bishop of Ely in 1496 came to see how things were going, said that there were only 2 nuns left, and kicked them out and replaced it with an all-male college. We fixed that. Since then, we've made a number of other changes over the last few hundred years, but we have had that ethos as a centre of thinking, of work, of education, of scholarship since 1144, and many amazing people have come from the college to make a difference in the world. Thomas Malthus, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet. We've had more recently people like Clean Bandit. Do people know Rockabye? I'm seeing a few nods at least. Good. They've had billions of downloads. So if you haven't, they're a band that formed here, and there are many, many others. The Intellectual Forum is not as old as the college. We do not date back for hundreds of years. We were set up in 2016, partly to try to bring in amazing speakers and to reach out to the world beyond our boundaries. And this is one of the events that we do, and it's one I'm really excited about. It's been great chatting to our guest speaker, Dr. Leroy Logan, ahead of time, and as you'll see, he is a fascinating character in just so many ways. We're going to have a chat about his life, his experiences, just between the two of us. We'll then have a chance for you to ask questions about his life's work, his perspectives on all of this, or well, almost anything else. I'm sure you'll cope with anything you don't want to say. And we'll feed in pre-recorded questions from around the world using QCast. Now, he does have an amazing career. He's a member of the British Empire, which maybe we could discuss later about the Empire. But perhaps more importantly, he was with the Met. He was a superintendent, served 30 years. He was founder and chair of the Black Police Association. He was involved with the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry, Damilola Taylor, with the 2012 Olympics. He has a wonderful book, Closing Ranks, My Life as a Cop, which you'll be able to buy over there, signed by Leroy. If you are online, I'm sure there are ways to get there. I don't know where, and he may not be able to get to you to sign them. But before we actually have our conversation, one way to introduce him would be to show a short extract about the making of Red, White and Blue, which is one of the Small Axe series. Some of you may have seen it, directed by Steve McQueen. And we'll just start off with that as a brief introduction to give a flavour. And assuming this all works, no, I need to do that. Here we are with the true story from Small Axe.
Why did you want to join the police force?
It's always been an ambition of mine since I was a little boy. I feel I have a calling to protect and serve.
Stop police!
Red, White and Blue, which stars John Boyega as Leroy Logan, is the true story of Black police officer Leroy Logan, who, having been a successful research scientist at the Royal Free Hospital, decided to join the police force in 1981.
I applied to combat negative attitudes. There are divisions and misunderstandings, and I think I could change that.
He was a dedicated police officer, though in fact he suffered a great deal of racism within the force itself.
Control 360 on site, backup requested. Leroy Logan is one of the first black police officers in the London Met. He's a massive community man, connects with so many people in his area that he felt like his expertise when needed in a job that was more on ground and that directly affects the people around him.
Look at you! Oh, Lee said that you joined up, but I thought, no way.
He's loving, charming, funny, loves British funk.
Go ahead, Leroy.
His best friend called Lee and lives a big family-oriented life.
I came Kenneth Logan, who is the father of our lead protagonist, Leroy Logan. Something horrific happens to his father at the hands of the police, which makes his decision all the more fraught and causes something of a rift between him and his father.
You were supposed to take my children and show how that we are different. You made us feel like we could be a part of everything. You wanted us more British than the British.
It's easy to make that decision in 2020, but back then, like, black people had a problem with it, white people had a problem with it.
I thought you were cool. What happened to you?
It's just important for those stories to be told so that we can stop the ignorance, the erased culture which wants to come in, control the way in which our history was.
If this gave people an indication of just how tough it has been, and how well we have done, how we have triumphed and continue to triumph, I think that would be a job well done.
Some of the benefits that you're experiencing, some of the stability that you're experiencing in this system is based on a bunch of Caribbean people that came onto a boat and helped build it up. And this is to put an eye on them and to actually in some way thank them for their input, you know, because they don't get enough praise.
Why did you back me? I'm out there on the field with no backup.
Stephen Queens.
So, please join me in welcoming Leroy Logan to the stage. So, must be fascinating to see yourself played by somebody else. But
it's pretty cool, isn't it? I mean, my grandchildren think I'm so amazing. I suppose most people have a bucket list saying, "Who would play me in a movie?" So I've already got that ticked. So I'm ahead of the game in that respect.
He was your choice, or?
Well, I had no choice because Steve McQueen's the type of person. Well, he chooses his cast, his behind the scenes people. But when I heard John Boyega was wanting to play me, he could have been on the other episodes of that Small X series. I was absolutely amazed, and I've got connections with John dating back from the Damilola Taylor investigation, because, as you know, I was involved in the investigation, and the last two people to see Damilola Taylor alive was John and his sister, because they went to the same primary school. So when I told him about that connection, and also Richard Taylor, Damilola Taylor's father, is my wife's cousin. So when I told him all these different connections, he was thinking, wow, I better play you then.
Absolutely. But can we jump back to the beginning? Could you just say a bit about your family, your upbringing, sort of before all of this started?
Yeah. Well, my parents from Jamaica, they were part of the Windrush generation. They were hard-working, God-fearing people who definitely responded to the call. The Enoch Powell speech, we need you to help build infrastructure. So my dad was a long-distance driver. My mother was a seamstress, dressmaker. And so they just settled in Islington in London. And yeah, I was just very blessed to have the parents I had. They gave my sister, myself, a very loving, nurturing home. And I really didn't realize how fortunate I was to have parents who just gave you strong work ethics and really, not to be defined by the people's points of view, but to know your own identity. And in fact, my mother helped me with that, because she decided to take my sister and myself back to Jamaica during primary school age. So this was like the early to mid 60s. I know I don't look it, but primary school was that long ago. And so I had a masterclass in identity during those few years in Jamaica. And so when I came back, I just felt, wow, I've seen black doctors, black lawyers, prime ministers, police officers. I can do whatever I want. Had a bit of a rude awakening. The education system was not fit for purpose in that respect. They tried to talk me out of it, but I pushed through in the end.
And so you pushed through with that experience, and you started off not anywhere near policing. You were a...
No, my first love was science. I did applied biology, at University of East London, and I did pharmacology. So I was really pleased to get my first job was at the Royal Free Hospital. It was in Hampstead in those days, but I was actually born in the original Royal Free Hospital in Islington, Liverpool Road. So I was so pleased with that. I thought, wow, this is great. So our path is set. And then the calling of policing caught me on the blind side, something terrible. I thought, no, this is not what I need. I want that safe, positive environment of science research and medicine, because that's what I was thinking I was going. And that's what my dad wanted me to do. He said, yep, great, you're doing us proud. And then all of a sudden, everything got turned upside down.
And I mean, you said you didn't want to, it was too easy, not challenging enough. I mean, is there ever regret that you didn't take that path and become the distinguished medical doctor, whatever field you'd have been in?
I did for years. The first 10 years in the Met, I thought, what am I doing? I was really questioning my sanity. Why would I leave that positive environment where I really meaningful work around clinical trials of certain drugs. I was especially with chemotherapy patients in pediatrics, especially, and so I couldn't understand why I would want to change that, and it happened very, very subtly. When I was, I joined the Royal Free in 1980, and you might remember the Brixton riots was in 81. The Scarman report was in 82, and so there was a real drive for black and minority ethnic recruits. And the local officers from Hampstead Police Station would use our sporting facilities at the Royal Free. So I'd see these guys in the gym, in the pool, in the squash courts, whatever. And I would see them in the bar, and then they would tell me, eventually they told me they're a police officer. I said, you would be great in policing. I said, no way. I actually thought my experience of policing during the 60s and 70s, the sus law that's the last thing you were doing. In fact, I realized if you want to reduce your Christmas card list by 95%, join the police. And that doesn't matter what color you are, and so it was my last thought. But once they started to talk me through it, and they took me on some drive rounds, I thought, wow, this is a good job. It's a meaningful job. It's helping people. Safety and security is so important for people, and but I still was trying to talk myself out of it. So I said to Gretel, Gretel, these guys are trying to talk me into policing. She said, well, why not? Because she's from Nigeria, so she's used to seeing black officers, so it's no big deal. It's a good job. And then my boss was doing my appraisal, and he said to me, Leroy, you're doing great work, fine, but I don't think it suits your personality. So I said, well, what do you think I should do? He said, I think you should be a cop, a police officer. And I couldn't believe it. I thought maybe he's been following me around, and he saw me going on these drive rounds and all these sort of things. So I thought, no. So I'm really running out of options now. So I went to my best friend, Lee John, and his mother, Jessie Stevens, is a community liaison officer. Again, she had experience working with the police, building bridges with the community. And I said, oh, Jessie, I'm going through this. And she said, yeah, we need you. We need you to join the police. I thought, well, what can I do? And then I apply. And unfortunately, during the application process, you saw in the film, my dad gets beaten up by officers over a traffic matter. And I'm thinking, one, he's going to be upset I'm not doing science, possibly going into medicine, and now I'm going to join the ranks of the officers who beat him up. And I just couldn't put myself how do I put that to him? But it was taken out my hands when officers would check your address where you lived. I'd already moved on, and our address in Highbury obviously didn't come up on the application form as it should, because I did inform them. And officers went to my parents' address, and my dad answered the door, and he was told that I was joining the police. And well, you could see in the film he was not happy. He was not happy.
Oh, so he found out from the police, rather.
The police came to the door, and for children of parents from the Caribbean and Africa, the last thing you do is have police officers come to your door for any reason, good, bad, or indifferent. So when he saw them, and then they share the news that I'm applying to join the police, he was very upset. But to his credit and his love for me and his real wisdom, he still supported me to join. And in the film, you see him drive me to Hendon with Al Green music in the background. It was nothing like that. There was no Al Green music. There was no soft, tender moment. He dropped me, said, "Get out," and that was it. But he came to a passing out parade, and that was really good.
And I mean, you weren't the first black police officer, but you must have been one of a tiny handful at the time.
Yeah,
do you know how many?
Less than 50 black officers across the Met, which was over 30,000 cops at the time.
So, I mean, phenomenal. And what was your early experience like? And we'll come to some of the big stories later, but how did you find it?
Well, it just reminded me of school, because I knew leaving science and that working environment, the medical unit, the Royal Free, was going to be light years away from a very testosterone-driven, militaristic type of environment, and I was not overestimating how bad it would be. It was terrible. I mean, even at Hendon Training School, you still had to put up with people using casual racism, the N-word, the P-word, the W-word, sexist words, and I was thinking, what am I doing? Why would I want to put myself through it? And I remember I made a real rod for my back. Was my first week at Hendon. They went around the class and they said, what's this? Why do you want to join the police? I said, well, I'm here to, make changes from within. I'm not here to make friends. I'm specifically here to make change from within. So this is before emails and social media. But rumour control in those days was just as fast. So I was already pointed out as a bit of a troublemaker, because I was a bit older than the other officers. I was 26. I was married. We had our first child, was born in Hendon, week 10. So they're thinking, I'm going to watch this guy. A lot of them thought I was an undercover journalist. And I heard they thought I was going to write a book. Well, actually, they're right. It took me about 30 years later, but I did write the book.
And because you've had a number of experiences, at what stage did you feel that you had to work with the other officers and set up the Black Police Association?
Well, even as a constable at Islington, and Islington was my first police station, so I knew the area. I felt comfortable. I even lived on the borough, so it was really great to have that that platform, and so I wasn't having to assimilate into the culture. I'll integrate, work with my officers, even have strong team bonds, friendships, but I didn't have to lose my identity, and I had a strong sense of identity from Jamaica. So I was my principles and values, my beliefs. I'm a Christian, so I didn't find any need to acquiesce. Some people say, "Isn't it Christian? Isn't it tough being a cop?" Actually, I made it very simple for me. I'm not going to condone bad behaviour, whether it's police or the public. There's my red lines. You know where I stand. But there were still things I had to go through. Again, in the film, they wrote a big N-word on my locker, and it was in a secure area, so it can't be a member of the public. Even though, strange enough, at that time, the public were very positive. So I got more positive input from the public and my colleagues. So it was tough, but I knew there was a reason for me to join. I knew I'd be intentional in holding my identity, but I had to show my ability. So I was really strong on my work ethics. Did some really good jobs to clear up some major problems in certain communities. So operationally, I was sound. I was pretty fit in those days, so they had this grudging respect that I could outrun most of them. I was Met champion for high hurdles and 400 hurdles, so they thought, oh, well, okay, we just have to put up with him. But knowing that I was relatively good at dealing with the rough and tumble of the culture, but I saw other people who looked like me going through a really tough time, and there was an initiative in 1990 called the Bristol Seminars, where they bussed all the black officers from the Met into Bristol Polytechnic, as it was then, and I was one of them to say, this is what the culture is like. It's so toxic. A lot of people are leaving. You're 4 times more likely to leave the Met in your first 2 years if you're black than when you're white. So it was a really hostile environment. So coming together and developing that report, I was in one of the working groups, and in some of the old-fashioned type pushback, they've shelved that report for all sorts of reasons, and so we picked it up, we ran with it, and that was like our reference document for setting up the Black Police Association in London and eventually nationally.
But we'll talk maybe later about this idea of sort of bad apples and whether it's individual problems or more general. But you also faced a lot of systemic problems from above. I mean, there was an occasion where you investigated, was it 6 months, about an £80 hotel bill, which ended up in them paying you 100,000 or something?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Very expensive hotel.
Yeah, it was a very... No, I must admit, I knew because of... We set up the BPA in 94, the commissioner at the time, Sir Paul Condon, reluctantly supported us. He said I could stay on the fence, but it's a tough place to sit. So I will support the BPA reluctantly. And then our coming out sort of event was Macpherson. And our written and oral submission was like a lens in the culture. And so it's very evidence-based. It showed exactly where the systemic failures were. And because of that, we were highlighted in the report. And at the same time, I became the first national chair of the BPA. And so we owned the recommendations. And then there was independent oversight from the Stephen Lawrence Steering Group set up by Jack Straw with Neville and Doreen Lawrence. I was one of the representatives on that with chief constables and ministers, etc. And it was quite amazing to know. At that time, I was only an inspector, and I'm dealing with chief constables and ministers, Jack Straw, Paul Boateng, and I was thinking, God, this is what you want me to do. And that was the light bulb moment. I really understood that it was like a commission for me. It wasn't just a 9-to-5 job. And when I say that, people think he's a religious nut, isn't he? There's something wrong with that bloke. But I felt that strength of direction, and I knew that if I'm honouring God, he'll honour me. And he showed up in so many different ways. In fact, I say a lot of the times, you don't have to be a forensic scientist to know when God's DNA is all over the place. Because I actually joined the Met to become a forensic sergeant, but they civilianized it. But anyway, I stayed on. So I was very clear, purposeful, knowing what I needed to do through the BPA, and Macpherson was the sort of watershed opportunity to make that change. And it did make culture change, improving trust and confidence with the public, and it went against all the bad apple types. You know, obviously the good cops have to call out the bad cops, but if your culture of fear is preventing that, then you have to deal with the systemic failures to ensure you get a positive environment and people feel that they can whistle-blow without retribution or any sort of comeback.
And can we just talk a bit more about the Stephen Lawrence inquiry? I mean, that, you know, that awful murder and everything that followed. What was your role? And you know, you were involved as chair of the Black Police Officer Association.
I was the treasurer at the time for the London one, but myself and two other colleagues, Paul Wilson, who was the chair at the time, and Bevan Powell, he was the general secretary. I was the treasurer, and we realised we had to put in a very strong and clear and concise report of what was happening in the organisation. And it's because we actually love the organisation, we had to say it as it is, and we realised that there was nothing bad about the Met or other police services that cannot be put right by what's good in it. All the ingredients are there, you just need the right ethical leadership, the transparency, the accountability to go with it, and of course, well, we would love to have the political oversight to hold the Commissioner and Chief Constables to account, and not to gaslight people and think, nothing to see here, everything's fine. You know, it's even like what we're going through the last week since the coronation with the arrests of the peaceful protesters around the coronation, and the police reform bill being seen as, well, a way of just, you know, police officers being set up. So we made it very clear how we see that policing needed to improve, the culture had to improve, and we couldn't shy away from making that happen. And we followed it through, especially with the Stephen Lawrence steering group that was going on with different Home Secretaries, and we saw, as I said, that culture change. And overnight, literally, the casual racism, the P word, the N word, stopped. It literally stopped. So that's when I know that if you get the right leadership and the checks and balances, especially with supervisors doing the right job, maintaining their critical distance, you will see change. It can come back quite quickly.
And I mean, Macpherson was huge, as you've said. Hasn't fixed all the problems.
No, not at all.
How much of the job do you think it did?
Well, I mean, there's quite a few things that still stand strong since Macpherson, like the Racial Relations Amendment that came out of that, and hate crime was in the statute books. Family liaison officers, a lot of major incidences, that family liaison officer role is right across the country. The critical incidents training for senior investigators still goes on. So we've seen some tangible things that are still there. But obviously, if you don't have the independent oversight, especially with a political will behind it, the culture will default back to where it's comfortable. And we've seen some terrible outcomes where not only it's shown to be institutionally racist, but sexist, homophobic, and the accelerant to that has been social media. That has been the real lens to show what the culture is capable of. So you've seen, obviously, the Charing Cross social media group. Obviously, you saw what happened with Nicole Henry and her sister, their bodies being photographed and, you know, being circulated as a laugh. Sarah Everard, of course, and the way in which the cousins just showed that he was able to be protected and allowed to pass on his misogyny and sexism and his homophobia and various other things without there being any comeback until he obviously kidnapped, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. So he had to be protected. And we've seen Carrick, how he's a multi-rapist, how same unit, the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Group, has been allowed to protect these officers. And, you know, their nicknames was Rapey. And everyone knew what they were about. And when they were arrested, they weren't brought to the notice of people doing the vetting. In fact, they shouldn't have been in the Met in the first place because of vetting. So you think, I'm not saying it was perfect at my day because I've been retired 10 years now, but the fact that what are the supervisors doing, the sergeants, the inspectors, how are they allowing this? Because I used to run teams for 25 years during my 30-year service. And so you've got to know your team, you can't just sit in an office, you've got to work with them. And I know since 2010 and austerity has really reduced the number of officers drastically, and supervisors have a higher ratio of constables to report on. And I know that it's very challenging, and they've done an amazing job considering, and they lost 20,000 officers across the country. But all of a sudden, they really need to understand what their teams are doing. But I truly believe that they haven't maintained that critical distance, because to really be a strong leader with a good grip and to get the best out of your team, you've got to maintain that critical distance. If you narrow it too much, then you become a sergeant who's really with a constable mentality, because you want to keep, your popularity. And knowing I was not Mr. Popular, joining the Met in the first place, being a supervisor actually was no big thing. I could maintain that critical distance because I don't want to allow things to start festering. And you've got to nip these things in the bud. So if you have got an officer who's got any sort of tendencies that's not appropriate for the office of constable, then you've got to try and develop them. If not, you've got to sanction them or maybe dispense with their services.
There's an immense amount I'd love to pick up on. We do want to have some other questions. We've seen KC. It was also, it was astonishing. Just before I finish, one final question from me, and then we'll have questions from the audience online and QCast. What was the best bit for you? What was the highlight of your career? We've mostly talked about the negatives and the downsides. What was the best thing you did as a police officer?
Survived 30 years with a joy in my heart, a smile on my face, and in all honesty, I think I was very fortunate to be in amazing positions. At a very early stage, I was involved in a serial killer called the Stockwell Strangler, and Erskine was bad news, but I remember when we arrested him and he was put before the courts, and the relief of local people. You could see the relief that, especially he picked on elderly people. So seeing that, and then of course seeing the solidarity with the Lawrence family and how that helped them to get through. In a lot of ways, I identify with them because they're of Jamaican heritage. In fact, Neville lives very close to my family in Jamaica. So that has been really good. But I think it's always been just carrying out my purpose and not doing anything at the expense of people. I can still look myself in the mirror and say, I've done the best I could. It wasn't perfect. It was tough on the family. I've tried to put it in the book. It was very tough on Gretel and the children. Very demanding. I suppose a lot of ways. Sometimes I did bring work home with me. But no, I just think it's carrying out my purpose. And part of that was working with young people. One of the things we started in the BPA in the late 90s was the Charitable Trust, and we developed a leadership program for Year 9 students, and they do a 100-hour modular program on leadership, knowing the rights and responsibilities, and developing positive peer-to-peer mentoring. And that's still going on now. It's now called Void Youth, and in fact the CEO is someone that used to be one of my biggest challenges when I was a probationary constable in the mid-80s. And through working with him, we're now working with Voyage. So it's amazing how these relationships develop. And so working with young people has been something that I still do. And then public service is still in my veins. You don't just switch it off. And I enjoy doing public service through various charities, through the church. Go to in Saint in Hackney. Hi, people in Saint. Just really, really great working with them, and that in a lot of ways, I'm just thankful that I've still got that desire to continue working to make changes and get the benefits. So I can sometimes be disappointed, but I'm not discouraged, and I'm really pleased that I'm not discouraged. I know Gretel might be thinking, when is this man going to retire? One day, darling. But, as long as, again, I believe I've got a role to play, then I'll continue as long as I've got health and strength.
So the final thing I'd like to ask is the question I asked on QCast, so you know what's coming. We've talked about all of these issues. You mentioned Republic, and Graham, the leader of Republic, is a friend and colleague of mine. So, we talked about this a bit earlier. But recent surveys show that trust in the police is plummeting, particularly among young people, particularly among ethnic minorities, a whole set of groups. Right now, do you think we should trust the police?
Yeah, I mean, we need to, even though they don't deserve it. They haven't done themselves well in so many respects. I mean, the amazing thing is, up until Sarah Everard, the majority of people would believe in the police. They would say, well, actually, that person must have done something wrong to come to the notice of police. But when they look at the story of Sarah Everard, and she was just going home, and a police officer did that to her, all of a sudden people are starting to say, well, actually, maybe that trust is not just given without them earning it. So police need to earn trust. It's not given. But I think, as I've said before, there needs to be, the experience of policing has to be different, especially for people of black and minority ethnic origins. They need to understand that the experience, when you've been stopped and searched 3-4 times a month, if not more, the trauma that causes, and the hurt and the humiliation. So they need to acknowledge they've got a problem. And then if you deal with that problem, you've got to measure it. Because what gets measured gets done. And then people need to see their experience of policing changing. They cannot see, well, you're gaslighting them, everything's fine, and their experience is totally different. And like the current commissioner, Mark Rowley, I think he's doing as much as he can. I think he could do a lot better by even acknowledge that they're institutionally racist and not say, well, it's all semantics. Well, Paul Condon accepted institutional racism, and he's no different to Mark Rowley. But the approach is different. Unfortunately, I think Suella Braverman allows the commissioner to get off the hook a bit, but let's not go into that. But yeah, I really believe that that trust needs to be earned, and don't gaslight people and think everything's fine and they're just going to accept it, because that's not the case anymore.
Sadly true. Thank you. So we now have time for questions from you, the audience, here, there, and from QCast. If you would like to ask a question, could you just please raise your hand? I'll try to get one of the microphones over to you. And if we start off with one in the room over here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, do you think we'll ever see police back on the streets? You know, I understand about the trust, but we don't actually interact with the police unless something bad happens. Whereas we used to see police on the streets and you'd feel safe, but you also get that connection. Do you think we'll ever see that again?
I would like to think so. I know they've from Boris Johnson saying he wanted 20,000 cops back on the street, because remember, austerity, it took away 20,000 cops. But it's a question of getting those experienced officers and those citizen-focused officers. I remember setting up the Safer Neighbourhood teams in Hackney. We're the second borough in the country to do it. And I literally handpicked those sergeants and to ensure that we have a sergeant, 2 constables and 3 PCSOs, police community support officers, on each of those Safer Neighbourhood teams. They were ring-fenced. They were there to build those connections. And again, the Met wasn't perfect, but at least you had that core officers who were there. You see them regularly. You would have community action groups. You know, that was their job, and not being distracted elsewhere. So I would like to think you'd at least get them back, and hopefully understanding that policing cannot be done by automatic number plate recognition or AI or anything else. It's a relationship. You know, Sir Robert Peel said those immortal words, or it's assigned to him, that the police are the public and the public are the police. It's a contract. You have to work together. You cannot ignore that. It's not firefighting policing we find at the moment. You're just reacting from one incident to another. It has to be more early intervention, prevention. There needs to be more proactivity. You're not going to get information from people who don't trust you. They won't talk to you. They won't believe that you'll do anything. But I do believe that this government has set up officers in a way that we've seen with the policing of the protesters against the coronation. Those officers weren't trained. It was literally rushed through, and those officers, I'm not giving them excuses, but there is the pressure from the top saying, right, under no circumstances do we get that. And that just erodes trust. So it's not just about officers on the streets. We want officers there, but we want them to have the right attitude and understanding you're a servant, you're a public servant. That's why I talk about service. That's the key for me. And that pastoral element of policing, I think, is so important. Knowing that you're there to be an assistance and a solution, and not just, into control and power. So, in a word, yes, I would like to think it's going to come back, but it's going to take time.
So we've had some pre-recorded questions from this QCast system. I want to try to get one of those in, and then I'll come back to a couple of others. So this is a new experiment for us, so let's see how it works. So Leroy, here's the first question from Jason Cavan.
Hi Leroy, hi everyone at Jesus College. Got a question for you. About 10 years ago, I wanted to be a special constable. I went through my training at Hendon, all the role play stuff, did really well, came out with some good grades. But when it came to a financial background check, I had a parking ticket and it went to a CCJ and I wasn't able to progress. So I thought it was fair enough, because they said, I could be up for being bribed, etc. But that made me think with Carrick and Cousins, how did these guys sit through the net? And maybe if they had a parking ticket or a CCJ, maybe a woman would still be alive today, and there wouldn't be a bunch of rape victims in the wake of Carrick. Wonder what you think about that.
So,
well, actually, before I answer that, I just want to highlight my colleague. Shabazz Graham. He's the master of QCAS, so I just want to recognise him. So give him a bit of encouragement. It's experimental, but we see that it's got some really learning opportunities there. But yeah, it's sad when you lose good quality applicants over technical issues. In those days, when he applied, obviously the vetting was very strict. Some a bit too strict from my point of view, because I mean, CCJ is not the end of the world. It's not like, unless there's some dishonesty involved, and that's different. But to know that he could have been an officer really saddens me that it didn't go through, because it seems like he could have been a good officer. But yes, we've seen through Carrick and Cousins and other officers, not just in London, in Met, but elsewhere, that there's definitely been a lack of vetting, a lack of the checks and balances I've spoken about. And of course, we've allowed some really hard people into the organisation, or in there for the wrong reasons. It's around control and power, and that's not. You're a public servant. I don't know to what extent that is. Some people say, oh, it's a few bad apples. I'm not too sure if it's a few bad apples and the whole barrel is rotten to some extent. Because what actually happens when you've got some rogue cops in your team, they can contaminate the other officers, especially those that have assimilated. And so it dumbs down their thinking what's normal. Because some of the things that you hear on these social media groups on how they think it's funny just to talk about people in such terrible ways, or dead bodies or something like that. And you think to yourself, when has it gone that bad? I mean, I know sometimes when you're in emergency services, you might have some sort of humour as a way of dealing with stress and the pressure and the trauma, but you just cannot allow it to get that bad that you have officers who weren't allowed to come in through the lack of vetting, and then contaminating other officers and let them think that they can just say and do anything and they're untouchable. And that's the thing that really needs to come out, that the rogue officers need to be called out by the good officers. And the whistleblowing, those officers have to be supported. If not, we're going to be talking about this in 10, 15, 25 years' time.
So part of the hope is that people can respond to these questions later on and the dialogue can continue, and we'll see how well that works. Can I ask a question from the Master, Sunita?
It was a follow-on question about the vetting, and the QCAS question asked that question. But it was like, what are the ways you think that the vetting could be improved? Kind of take it onto that level, and then also you talked about the fact about when you started, what the numbers of black and ethnic minority officers were in the Met. Where is it now? What are the things that we should be doing, or should we be doing, to kind of ask more people to kind of join, make a difference in the community?
Yeah. What can you do with vetting? Build back the number of people back into those units, because they are overworked. I remember even when I was in the Met, it would take a few months to do a proper vetting. Now, they seem to be doing it in weeks, and sometimes a high caseload of people, they're not checking everything, and then people are slipping through. Also, you've got to highlight where officers are being protected. Carrick and Cousins were protected. So Cousins came from another force area, and he came to notice in his previous force area, and he was protected. For what reason? I don't know. And the same thing happened in the Met. Cousins and Carrick are good examples of how people can get protected. And these misplaced loyalties is a big issue. So you need to get the vetting right. You cannot allow people to be protected, especially those ones who are rogue cops, the bad cops. They shouldn't be in the policing. In fact, some of them should be behind bars. So that's the other thing. And you've got to, the interview process has to be a lot more challenging so that people can't just say the right things. They have to do psychometric testing, I truly believe, to ensure that you weed out those who are really just good at interviews and got the power of the pen, that sort of thing. Sorry, what was your second question about the...
It was about the numbers now.
Yeah, the numbers, yeah. Yeah, the numbers have actually maintained pretty well. Because we saw when, before Macpherson, it was about 3 to 4% were black and minority ethnic out of 30-odd thousand cops. And then through Macpherson, there was a real increase. So it went up to about 13, 14% of 30-odd thousand officers. Because it's fluctuated around the 33, 34,000 mark before austerity in 2010, and it went below 30,000 at one stage. But in terms of it being reflective, that's the other thing. Recruiting has always been good in terms of applicants. Black and minority ethnic applicants have always been about the 20% mark. But are they getting through the interview process? The vetting. And then are they staying because of the culture they have to go through? As I said, 4 to 5 times more likely to leave if you're black than you're white in the first 2 years. And I remember knowing those stats even before I joined. I said, if I can just get through the first 2 years, I can do the other 28. And I had the worst reporting sergeant in the world. And I thought, if I can get through that 2 years, I can do the rest. And unfortunately, I was able to do that. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people haven't got, the strength of character to just go through that day in, day out. It's draining. It really is. Because in a sense, in the name of humour, officers can be sexist, racist, homophobic, you name it, because it's only a joke. You're too thin-skinned. I didn't mean it, it's just a joke. But if you're getting that every single day, and, it's that sort of drip, it's those microaggressions that are really very subtly, but very effective. So the numbers in terms of initial going in, up to the first 2 years, is quite healthy. It's just it tails off. So at the moment, it's still around the 14, 15% of 30-odd thousand cops. But it should be much higher than that. In fact, during Macpherson, one of the recommendations around recruitment, retention, progression, and they were saying the Met could be reflective of London by 2030. They've now gone to 2070 before the Met will be reflective of London. And in fact, the only week before last, the Met was the only force area not to hit those recruitment targets of those 20,000 they're trying to bring it back to the original numbers. So the Met in itself has got extra challenges because it's the largest force by far. It's twice the size of the next one, Greater Manchester Police, and also it's got a very toxic culture that people are just not thinking, this is not for me. Why should I go through this draining process?
So we had a lot of questions submitted beforehand. I suspect we're not even going to get through our shortlist, but I would like to turn to another one of those, if that's all right.
Okay, yeah.
Which hopefully...
You're doing very well, Julian. I mean, he's only had a crash course on this.
And love that you're doing this. We in South Africa obviously have our own checkered past and present when it comes to all things race, especially involving the police force, people of colour within the police force. And so my question to you is maybe a bit of a tricky one, a bit of a hospital pass, but how much of you, or what percentage of you believes that the change that needs to happen, the work that you're doing to make the change happen within the police force, concerning people of colour, how much of you believes that it is going to happen, that we're going to get there, that you are going to make it? Thank you.
very similar to your question. You know, I'm still very optimistic. I truly believe that the BPA is still in existence, and other staff associations are there, not just in London, but nationally. And those officers are still going through a really tough time, but they're still sticking with it. They're not in the numbers that we should. So I'm still positive. I still believe, when I speak to officers, I still speak to them. I'm still doing police training. I train police recruits in the North East Command of the Met. And I see some really positive people, because in all honesty, the reputation of the Met is having a massive impact on recruiting, and those people are still going through the process, and they really want to do as much as they can. And they realise they're going into a culture that they have to withstand that and be themselves, and not to in any way let themselves down, or their families down, or their communities down. So those sort of people are still there, and so I'm encouraged by that. But like everything, it needs the ethical leadership at the top to encourage them. We cannot allow people who've got their own agendas to push back on that. And I would like to think the communities are there coming back, say, listen, we know you're not perfect, but we've got to work with you, because we want safety and security. We want law and order. We want our young people, especially, not to go through the same injustices and inequalities that our generation have gone through. And, I said that, one of the things I say is that I don't want my grandchildren's generation to go through the same injustices as previous generations have gone through. I want them to live in an environment where people are accepted and achieve their true potential and don't have to go through toxic environments. And it's not just indicative of policing, is it? Unfortunately, having issues in firefighters and other, even in the military to some extent, even though they've got their act together a lot better than the police. But again, it's not perfect, but if you can see green shoots of improvements, let's really nurture that. Let's really build that. So, yeah, I really think we can get back the service. And the amazing thing is, the Met and the other police services across the country are still the envy of the world. They cannot believe we patrol without firearms or sidearms or anything like that. So
it's good to know it could be worse.
Yeah, exactly, especially what we see in the States.
So can I move on to a question that's come from online, from Marisha Ray, who you may remember from your time in Islington.
Yeah.
Councillor there. And Marisha says she'd like to ask you, to what extent are police in the UK performing the roles that would be performed by health services, mental health services, psychological services and social care in other countries?
Well, I've always said that police officers aren't trained to deal with people with mental health issues. They're trained in a lot of ways, and it's perpetuated by the culture, that invariably they go into a situation and they escalate. Very rarely do they de-escalate. They're not very good at de-escalating, especially if someone, they think, why are you acting that way? Why are you being suspicious? Not looking at me. There must be something else up. And so they tend to escalate things. And especially if someone's suffering from mental health issues, escalating is the last thing you do. And body slamming them and handcuffing them and tasering them to the extent they might jump off Chelsea Bridge, as we had in one case, or people have died from multiple taser shots. So when it comes to mental health, I really think that it should be at least a triage approach. So officers who are responding to those calls need to be responding with trained social workers or psychologists to the extent, or paramedics who have got that sort of training to ensure that officers are there to enforce if need be, but that real bespoke approach is, done on a more consistent basis. Because we've seen too many cases where in the Premiership footballer who was killed by an officer who's doing manslaughter. Now, that officer was not trained in it, and so that's why I think in a lot of ways some officers are being set up, but they fall in line with this control and power. I'll deal with it. Well, not you cannot have a hammerhead mentality that everything looks like a nail and you have to just hammer it in. No. So the public health approach recognizes being not only trauma-informed, but trauma-responsive, and having specialist triage approach, especially in dealing with mental health cases. So I think that needs to be brought in. I know violence reduction units that have been brought in London and across the country are trying to assist police crime commissions to do that. But again, a lot of it is the lack of assets and that not seen as a priority. But it needs to be prioritised, because I think one of the major elephants in the room is how many people are suffering from mental health issues, especially since COVID. This has never been assessed, and we need to have not only policing but other organisations that are trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and understand the signs, and to be a lot more proactive at how they de-escalate and assist people, and see them more as patients, not just potential prisoners.
Thank you. We had a couple of responses to a question I asked on this system, two of which were particularly powerful, one of which did talk about exactly what you've been talking about with responses. But could I now turn to Des Brown?
Hi, as introduced, Des Brown here from Start to Life. And again, this is another question for Leroy, who I'm understanding is at Jesus College in Cambridge asking questions. One of the things that I'm always trying to grapple with in this sector of trying to address disproportionality in the criminal justice system is the difference between a stop and search, where it has to be intelligence-led, and what they can, and correct me if I'm wrong, administer what they would call a stop under suspicion. Now, I know there may need to be a little bit more direction around the legalities of that, but hence my question, because there's a lot of young people that may be stopped, and it's not intelligence-led, i.e. it's not stop and search, and have they got the data on that, and how do you think the police could better address that so that they're held to account for what they would call a stop and not stop and search? Thanks.
Actually, is my boss. I do the police training through Des. Trust him to come up with a difficult question. Thanks for choosing that, Jenny. No, stop and account and stop and search are two different things, all on the same journey. So you can stop and someone to account for themselves. Now, in answering those questions, it doesn't necessarily mean they're suspicious, but it might be through the questions and answers saying, why are you in this building? Do you have a tag? No. Well, why haven't you got a tag? Are you a member of Jesus College? No. So why are you here? That's stop and account. It might be now you got reasonable grounds to suspect that they might be in as trespassers. So you might want to verify from them what is the reason for them to be here. And if they, again, cannot answer the questions, they're not visiting someone, or they're not attending a lecture, or whatever it may be, then that can give an officer reasonable grounds to suspect they might be in possession of something, maybe a weapon or drugs. But so it's part of the journey that you have to ask questions from stop and account to stop and search. And that's one of the things that we talk with our young people in Voyage during that BTEC Level 2 leadership program, knowing their rights and their responsibilities. So it helps the officer to know that that person being cooperative, and also it helps the young person to not sometimes follow the crowd and being very animated and very disrespectful to the officer. Because invariably, if you're respectful to the officer, they normally reciprocate, and vice versa. So we actually give them an acronym which police officers are actually trained in, and it's called Go Wise. So GO, G is the grounds, why that person is being stopped, what is the information. So, yep, you're in Jesus College, you haven't got a tag, but someone has told us that there might be someone that's gone through certain rooms and certain property is missing. So I will say, well, I would like to speak to you about that. So I will tell them clearly what the grounds are, what I'm looking for. There might be stolen credit cards, wallets gone, whatever it may be. That's the objective, O, so G-O. And then, even if I'm in uniform, I can show them my warrant card, which is normally you have a photograph with the signature of the commissioner or the chief constable and the badge for that force area. So I'll show them my warrant card if they want it. Their identity, which is their name. Normally you see that on the name badge next to their body cam anyway. But you're entitled to know the identity. The station attached is S for Y, so it's W, warrant card. I is the identity. S is the station attached. And E is their entitlement to the stop slip. So that helps the young people to know the rights and responsibility so that they don't feel that it's totally alien. It's still going to be embarrassing. It's still traumatic. It's still something that they'll never forget. Because in the first scene of that Small Axe film is little Leroy, 12, 13, coming from band practice at school and being stopped in the school gates. And my white counterpart, members of the band that evening, not being stopped. And I can remember it, and it's over 50 years ago. So I know how that can really have a massive impact. So that's why it's really important to be trauma informed and trauma responsive, so that you can understand and put that person at ease. Listen, I know it's embarrassing, but I just want to get through this. If you are here in this premises for a legitimate reason, you'll be on your way. And understand that pastoral element is really important. Don't get me wrong. I mean, if I need to be hands-on, I'll be hands-on. Well, I'm not being soft on crime. I'm just getting the best out of that situation. And I know a lot of people I've stopped and searched. I've never had to body slam them. In fact, I don't get my uniform dirty, so I'm not going to be rolling around, rolling around and all that. For me, it's a defeat. Arresting someone is a failure sometimes, but it has to be done. But there's a way you do it. So I think that's the sort of thing we tell young people, and a lot of them have really appreciated having that background information.
Thank you. We are beginning to run out of time. There's a lot of questions still here, online and in the room. So can I ask, I can't say much to the people who pre-recorded them, but could I ask questions to be relatively brief? And perhaps the answers may be...
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. I think there's a question up here.
Thank you. I had a question about, obviously, as you said, a lot of forces, they've met their uplift target. So a lot of officers are very new, they're young, many are born after Stephen Lawrence died. A lot of frontline officers, response officers, have less than 5 years service. Do you think that means will help the culture reset because there's so many young officers in service, or that there's the risk that there's a loss of sort of not officers with experience to pass that on to the younger officers?
Well, if you don't really deal with the culture itself, especially the career constables, the ones who are on response teams, a lot of them set the tone. You'd think the sergeants and inspectors do, but sometimes we call them the old sweats. They can really make it high or low in terms of toxicity, and the getting the best out of the team. So it's I always think it's good to have recruits who've got life skills. No disrespect to young people coming out from school or straight up from college or uni, whatever. But I think the more life skills they have, doing volunteering, assisting in extracurricular activities that build up those sort of skills of reading people and knowing how, get the best from other people and having a clear sense of your beliefs and values. Because if you don't have that, then you can actually assimilate into the culture and you won't feel anything of it. I know I'd feel so alien if I'd assimilated in the culture of the Met, because it would be going against a lot of the things I knew was important to have an organisation that respects all cultures and backgrounds. And I couldn't be sitting there listening to them talk about black people or women in a way that they sometimes can. And I could just put up with that. No. So I really, I'll close by saying this. The recruits I'm seeing at the moment, because they're not in the centralised training program where the culture is so strong and it's their first exposure to that, and it's easy to fall in line and acquiesce. But they decentralised it, especially in the Met. So I'm seeing them having their own minds. They're not perfect, but they're really doing well to think around what policing is all about, how do I do the best I can, and work with my colleagues, and understand it's around relationships. That's what I talk about. They think I'm going to talk about all these stats and everything. I talk about relationships. How do you build a relationship in your team, with the community, etc. So I'm starting to see, even those younger ones, they seem to be a lot more switched on. And hopefully the culture won't change that.
Fantastic. I'm going to skip through some brilliant questions because I want to get to this one.
Hi, Leroy. I was wondering, what do you think the best thing or things that we as individuals can do? What do you think they are in order to encourage change in policing? Is it campaigning, voting, protesting, legal processes, speaking up, listening? Essentially, what can we do to help?
All of the above. No, I as I said, the police are public, the police. I don't think we as the public should just buy into the fact that we can only keep our communities safe and secure by just police officers or the number of police officers. I know a lot of people think it's just about police officers, but I think it's how you buy into your community as well. I think it's really important to know, why do police officers work the way that they do? One of the things I always find quite difficult to understand is when there's been a critical incident, whether it's a stabbing, shooting or whatever, they will do reassurance patrols. Well, having loads of cops in certain communities is not reassuring, especially if their experience is their day-to-day negative type of policing activities. They've been stopped several times, they've been disrespected, traumatized, etc. So I think it's important that people understand how they can work with police. If they've got the time, they can volunteer. Independent advisors, community liaison officers. They've got different titles for these roles in different force areas. But it's also, you can be an advisor to your police crime commissioner. I know MPs work very closely with their chief constable or their police crime commissioner. And there's various roles, independent advisors are key individuals that can influence policing on a regular basis. And also, I know municipal mayors, they have opportunities for communities to work, and obviously their assemblies, again, So I think it has to be a two-way process. I think we cannot just think it's all down to police and they should do it themselves. And I'm not saying go doing vigilantes or, citizens arrests and all these sort of things, unless you think that that's the only other alternative. But vigilantes is definitely a no-no. But I think it's really important that people understand that we're in a day and age that resources and assets are stretched, and we need to understand how can we do our best to assist. And I don't think volunteering and supporting less fortunate people, vulnerable people, is definitely something that we all can do. And that's why, 10 years after retiring, I'm not chilling out on a beach somewhere in the Caribbean or Africa. I'm busier now than I have been. Even in the Met, some people say I wasn't busy enough in the Met. Well, that's another story. But, I still am involved in the charity sector, in the voluntary sector. I still get calls, social media, people wanting my support. I can't stop that. I wish I could. I know my wife would like me to stop. But, I've told her I'll give it a few more years, as long as I've got health and strength. But I think we all have to understand that we have to contribute to our communities and our neighbours and our streets. Easier said than done, I know. But wherever you can, give the time, I think it'd be very valuable.
I think it's a brilliant way to finish this off, and I'm sorry to people whose questions we haven't managed to get to. So Leroy will be around if you're here in the room, and happy to chat. You can also see the other questions on this QCast thing, and please do give feedback about how that worked. You can also see responses. There's responses to a question I put there about trust in the police. Two of which I think were particularly moving, and one of which I now understand is being investigated further because of what was what was revealed in that. So
at the highest level.
So if you are interested in that, do have a look, and we will see. But Leroy, can I thank you so much for being with us to share your life as a cop, but also your views, the work that you've done. And so thank you for everything you've done, everything you will do, and for being such a fantastic guest tonight. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that's it for tonight. The Intellectual Forum does lots of different things, and I hope you'll come to some of our other events. So next week is a completely different subject. We have Riccardo Bellini, who's the chief executive of the sustainable fashion company Chloe, coming to talk about fashion and sustainability. Very different topic, very important, and there's much, much more to come. So we hope we'll see you again in person or online, or perhaps on this new QCast thing, where you can ask questions and respond to them. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And for those in the room, Shabazz would love to hear your thoughts. And I think we'll be there with a camera if you would like to record a response to Leroy, a question or anything else like that. But thanks for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you.